This is known as the social identity theory, and it was proposed by Henry Tajfel in 1979. He proposed the idea that we divide the world into groups. In-group, which is a group we belong to, and the out-group, the group that we're not a part of. We tend to exaggerate the similarities among individuals in our own group and the differences among groups in general. And by doing so, competition sometimes arises, and even prejudice and stereotypes. It can lead to, in extreme cases, intergroup violence or even a genocide. This was partly the case in the Rwandan genocide of 1994, which resulted in over 500,000 deaths. There are three stages to the social identity theory. The first is categorization. We assign not only ourselves, but everyone around us into groups, and we do this simply to make sense of the world. I'd like everyone to take a minute to think about how they would categorize themselves. We can belong to multiple groups, so you don't have to define yourself by one single thing. You can take a minute to write it down or just think about it. So for me, it's Muslim, female, student, Tanzanian, Indian. So because we can belong to so many different groups, it means that at a subconscious level, we act differently according to who we are with. We identify social norms and we adjust accordingly. The second stage is identification. Within this stage, we adopt the shared identity of the group that we are with, and furthermore, begin to internalize those social norms. The last stage is social comparison. We have the biological need to maintain the image of our group, and thus we compare ourselves favorably in regards to other groups. The groups we identify with give us a sense of pride and self-esteem, and we attempt to maintain this, so the groups that we're not a part of are subject to prejudice. So, behavior in groups are a huge part of who we are, even in predominantly individualistic societies, and social norms are prevalent everywhere. Social norms are simply behaviors and ideas and morals and values that are accepted. They're the unwritten rules of our societies. So we learn social norms and we adjust accordingly. But with the rise of globalization and social media, it's become harder to define our own social norms, except what the majority is doing. And thus we get to where we are now. The majority is largely represented, sharing their ideas, their behaviors, their morals, and discriminating against the outgroup, those who don't fit in. And it leaves the minorities two choices: to either face social isolation and marginalization, or accept new norms and assimilate. This accepting of new norms and assimilating is known as the idea of conformity. In 1951, Solomon Asch conducted a laboratory experiment on college male students. They were told that they were participating in a visual task, but it was actually about how they would react in regards to group behavior and conformity. Each participant was asked to match lines that looked the same in terms of length. As you can see, the right answer was always clear. But all but one of the participants were actors, and they were given specific instructions. On some of the trials, they were supposed to give the right answer, but on others, the wrong one. And the nature of the experiment was such that the real participant was always set up to give their answer last. And so it was a great way to see conformity. The results showed that 36.8% of participants conformed to incorrect answers, and overall, 75% conformed to at least one incorrect answer out of 12 trials. During the interviews conducted after, Asch linked the participants' reactions, whether they conformed and said the wrong answer, or stood their ground and said the right answer, to factors such as confidence, self-doubt, and the desire to be normative. So what? Humans love to conform, and we tend to fold in the face of adversities and differences. There's been countless studies displaying this. Another example is Janice in 1932, who asked participants to estimate how many beans there were in a glass jar. They were then put into groups and asked to discuss, and after, they were asked if they wanted to change their answers from earlier. And almost every single participant changed their answer to be closer to the group estimate. So, although we all like to think, no, I wouldn't conform, I would stand my ground, Social psychology tells a slightly different story. Research actually suggests that people are much more prone to conformity than they believe they might be. But what exactly is conformity, and how is it linked to representation? Well, conformity is defined whereby people change their beliefs, their values, their attitudes to more closely match the group they belong, want to belong, or whose approval they desire. So that means that this change in human behavior can happen in many different situations. In situations where we are unsure of what to do, we tend to look to others in order to imitate their behavior. For example, if you were in an airport and you were unsure of the correct procedure, you'd look to others to see what the right thing was, which makes sense. But the issue arises in unambiguous situations or subjective matters where we are really sure of ourselves, but then we change our mind after looking at others. How many of you have ever really enjoyed a book or a movie, but then changed your mind after reading some reviews online? This is the dangerous side of conformity, and the side that Ash and Janice aim to explore in their experiments. But it gets a little bit more complicated. In 1958, Kelman identified 3 different kinds of conformity. The first is compliance, and this is where an individual accepts group norms in order to avoid disapproval. But in private, the individual may disagree. The second is internalization. This is where an individual genuinely accepts group norms because it agrees with their own value systems. In this way, the beliefs of the group are internalized. The last is identification, and this occurs when an individual accepts influence in order to maintain expectations of a social role. This is famously seen in the Stanford prison experiment of 1973. This extremely controversial experiment shows how people can turn violent and follow these expectations that have no basis in real life. All these kinds of conformity show one simple thing: the human nature to change. The human nature to change a part of themselves, either permanently or temporarily, in order to fit into society, to be liked, or at the very least, avoid being disliked. And the idea of conformity can be simply explained by the bandwagon effect. This term is used to describe people who change their behaviors or their beliefs just because others are doing so. And as more people do it, others also hop onto the bandwagon, regardless of underlying evidence. I'm sure you can see the problem here, because if the majority of people are doing something, even if it is wrong, it will force others to join in too. And this continues to happen because people prefer to conform rather than stand out from a crowd and risk not being liked and not being accepted. And in our growing age of social media, this is a huge problem because it's become so much easier to see what others are doing and to simply adopt their behaviors and attitudes, even if it goes against our own value systems. So, although we all generally think that we want to be different and unique, in reality, straying from social norms leads to social isolation, and when faced with a task, we unfortunately tend to conform. Well, to recap, we've established that we want to conform, and we do this because we want to be accepted and we want to be liked. We don't want to risk being disliked. But what about the group of minorities that don't conform? What if they don't conform to what society sees as normal or what society sees as beautiful? Well, they feel the need to change. And this is because of the lack of representation. And that's where I fit in, because I'd like to conform too, but I don't in some aspects. So hi, this is me, and in case you haven't already noticed, I'm Muslim. And despite there being 1.8 billion of us, in many countries, we're a minority that is subject to hate crimes and unfair laws. This is a list of some of the countries that have implemented anti-Islamic legislation from around the world in the last decade. Or actually, it's a list of countries I wouldn't be too excited to visit anytime soon. The most recent being the hijab ban in France. Girls under the age of 18 are not allowed to wear the head covering, and mothers who do are not allowed to accompany their children on school trips. So back in 2013, when I turned 10, it came to a huge surprise to my parents when I practically begged them to let me wear the hijab. They were hesitant, but I was adamant, and finally they caved. I remember how they warned me of the difficulties, and I brushed it off because I was just so excited. In hindsight, I realized that the only reason I wanted to wear the hijab was because I wanted to look normal. Yeah, normal. Because in my group, wearing the hijab was normal, and it was so beautiful. And I marveled at my mom and my sisters who, in my eyes, had the privilege to put it on every single day. But that went all out the window when I walked into school the next day, and I realized I did look a bit different. And suddenly, I was in a lot of people's out-group. I had a few awkward stares here and there, and if I'm being completely honest, on most days it's been difficult. I've been told that I can take it off and that I'm safe here, often implying that I was forced into it. So I could actually stand here and talk about how Islam makes me more of a feminist and why we advocate for modesty and not objectifying women. But I'd much rather explain why, despite how much I love my hijab, it's still such a challenge to put on every single morning. To cut a long story short, it's simply the lack of representation that I felt. Actually, in the media, hijab barely exists. In the rare times it does, it's a character who needs liberation and end up lying to their conservative, abusive parents and end up taking their hijab off like 10 minutes after meeting a boy. But in all seriousness, in the 8 years that I've worn the hijab, I've never actually felt normal. And it's because the media has shoved down the version of who I'm supposed to be down my throat. But I'm really lucky because everywhere else, it's not just the feeling of being different, it's violence, it's social isolation. It means inequality for these minorities. It means social rejection. This is all too prevalent in our world today. Since August 25th, 2017, over 700,000 Rohingya have been forced to flee their homes. They're a Muslim minority group in a predominantly Buddhist area, and the United Nations describes this as genocidal violence following years of persecution and human rights abuses. And in the last decade, there's been a rise in hate crimes against Muslims, mostly in the West. This is a list of the most serious hate crimes against Muslims in the United States alone from 2012 to 2016. In compiling this list, I've left out the minor attacks, which were verbal abuse and vandalism. And most recently, this is Nathaniel Veltman. On June 8th, 2021, he ran his truck into a Muslim family on the street in Canada. Only their 9-year-old son survived. Can you imagine this 9-year-old boy waking up in the hospital to find out that his entire family was dead, simply because they were Muslim? And this is how the media reported him, not using his mugshot. Because to the media, a white terrorist is unfortunately not a terrorist. He's a mentally sick man, a loner, someone who had a troubled childhood. This is unfortunately the media's attempt to humanize him. And the media has subtly ingrained these ideas, so when I say terrorist, you think Muslim, and not someone that looks like that. And if you ever heard the call of prayer accidentally go off on my phone, you would unconsciously get uncomfortable. This is the impact of representation, or rather, the lack of the right kind of representation. But it's not just as Muslims, it's minority groups from all over the world who grow up thinking that they don't look correct. They're subject to prejudice, and they never see anyone that looks like them on TV or reads about them in groups. Minority groups grow up thinking that they're limited in opportunities simply because of what they look like or what they believe. But there is something I left out before. During the ASH experiment, if one of the actors said the correct answer, the real participants suddenly got the confidence to do so too. This shows us that when we are confident in our own beliefs and when we recognize that we're not alone, we actually end up standing up for ourselves. And we should recognize that minorities and humanity in general, we never are alone. Maybe some of us are represented less or marginalized more, but we're never truly alone. And researchers have actually shown that minorities can actually influence the majority in situations where a strong commitment to an alternative opinion is expressed. So I guess it isn't all that bad. All we need is one person to stand up, just one. We say that we wouldn't fold in the face of adversities and differences, but looking around us at the world today, are we standing up? Thank you.